one of the most famous things about Melbourne isn't an artwork, a place, or even a food, but rather a road rule. This is of course the famous or infamous hook turn, which continues to confuse tourists and amuse locals alike, as well as being the bane of learner drivers everywhere. So today we're going to look into this fascinating topic, as well as kick off a short mini-series that I'm calling A Transport Planner Explains. This will be a mini-series where I answer your questions and talk about related topics about transport planning, mainly here in Melbourne and Victoria. First off, let's explain what a hook turn actually is. So under the Victorian road rules, if you see a sign like this one at an intersection, you are not allowed to turn right from the centre of the road as you normally would. Instead, you have to wait in a designated bay to your left within the intersection, or as far left as possible if there is no marked bay. When the signal for the road that you are turning into shows green, then you make the right-hand turn and continue. Many intersections with hook turns now also have variable signs that tell you exactly when to wait and where to turn to make it as foolproof as possible, like this one at the corner of Collins Street and Elizabeth Street in the city. The main reason today for having hook turns is to avoid right-turning cars delaying trams which run down the centre of the road. This is why almost all hook turns are at intersections with trams, but there are some exceptions that we'll talk about a bit later. But where did hook turns actually come from? Well, to answer this question, we now have to do one of my favourite parts, which is a little bit of history. To start with, I was very surprised to learn when I was researching this video that the hook turn was actually the original default way to make a right-hand turn in Australia, rather than the current method of turning right from the centre lane. Back then, instead of a traffic signal, they would wait for the traffic police officer to give the signal to make the hook turn. And here's the bombshell. Melbourne was not actually the first or only place to have hook turns. In fact, these were widespread in Melbourne and many other places in the years before cars started dominating our roads and cities. But through the 1930s, as more and more cars started using our roads, motorists and lobby groups started advocating for the abolition of hook turns to make it more convenient for car drivers. Because of this, Sydney abolished their hook turns as the default standard in April 1939. While Adelaide did the same a few years later in 1950. These changes in other parts of Australia inspired some within Victoria to follow suit. Ministers and government officials began publicly calling for the abolition of hook turns and introducing centre turns into the state as well. The first confirmation that hook turns would be generally abolished in Victoria was in May 1953, made by the acting Premier at the time, Bill Galvin, after he visited Sydney and saw centre turns for himself. Then the Victorian Road Safety Conference made a recommendation to introduce it, supported by the RACV and police, claiming that it would make it easier for cars. In fact, it appears from what I can find that it was actually the police who were the major driving force behind the change. Chief Police Commissioner at the time, Alexander Duncan, is quoted as saying that he would not be satisfied until centre turns were introduced everywhere. He of course got almost all of his wish. So, following the lead of other states, centre turns were introduced into Victoria on the 1st of September 1954, and hook turns were abolished at almost every intersection overnight. And in a further concession to the motoring lobby, Melbourne actually introduced a rule that allowed cars to turn right at an intersection against a red light if the way appeared to be clear to the person driving. This of course caused a lot of confusion after it was introduced. The Argus newspaper sent out one of their reporters to try it out, and in this article from February 1956, they wrote about the unclear regulations and how the turns would delay trams. But some tried a different tactic and attempted to educate the public. The traffic inspector for Ballarat, J.H. Sorrell, sent notices around to all churches asking them to hold sermons on road safety and display signs saying Christian driving is safe driving. It's unclear how successful this was though. But unlike Adelaide, Sydney and the other places that abolished their hook turns, Melbourne did retain some at intersections where trams crossed. Today you'll find most hook turns in Melbourne in the CBD, but not every CBD intersection has one, even those with trams. For some reason, the one on the corner of Burke Street and King Street doesn't have a hook turn, even though there's plenty of room and it's just like any other intersection. I honestly don't know why. But if you're trying to escape hook turns and just never travel to the CBD, you will still not get away from them. Most famously, Clarendon Street in South Melbourne has hook turns all along its length, and there are others in place across Melbourne. As an added bonus, there are also a few hook turns that are not on tram lines. This includes the intersections of Exhibition Street and Lonsdale Street, and Exhibition Street and Collins Street, which are to make it safer for people riding bikes and walking over the pedestrian crossings. Speaking of bikes, there is another relevant road rule in Victoria. If you are riding a bike, you can actually make a hook turn at any intersection you like, unless there's a sign telling you otherwise. Some even have designated hook turns, like the intersection of Collins Street and Swanston Street here in the city. I hope you enjoyed today's video in this new mini-series. If you did, please subscribe to the channel so that you can stay up to date on future videos. Also, let me know in the comments below if there are any questions or topics that you would like me to cover about transport planning. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.